My children said, "You're lucky we feed you," so I sold the house and left them with nothing. My children said, "You're lucky we feed you," so I sold the house they lived in and left town. Then they looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're lucky we even feed you." In that moment, I realized my children didn't see me as their mother anymore, just a burden they tolerated. And that's when I decided they would never get the chance to humiliate me again. My name is Margaret Holt, and I'm 68 years old. I never thought I'd be telling this story, much less living it. For most of my life, I believed that love, especially a mother's love, was enough to earn respect. That if you sacrificed, stayed loyal, and put your children first, they'd eventually grow up to be the kind of people who'd look after you the way you once looked after them. But reality has a cruel way of stripping illusions bare. I raised my children, Daniel and Shannon, in a modest craftsman home on the outskirts of Madison, Wisconsin. My late husband Bill bought that house for us when we were both in our 20s. We scrimped and saved every dollar. We patched the roof ourselves when it leaked, painted the walls with our own hands, and built a life within those walls. After Bill passed, I tried to hold it together for the kids. I was only 50 at the time, and they were in college. Every bill, every late notice, every time I went without so they wouldn't have to, I did it willingly. I told myself this was what mothers did. We gave until there was nothing left, and even then, we found a way to give more. But no one tells you what happens when your children grow up and decide that your worth is measured in how useful or convenient you are to them. It started small. Little barbs at dinner about how much groceries cost. Comments about how I couldn't manage on my own. At first, I brushed it off. I blamed their stress. I told myself they didn't mean it. But over time, those small jabs became bigger, crueler, more deliberate. A month before everything changed, Daniel suggested I move in with him and Shannon to save money. My Social Security check had never stretched far, and with the cost of everything going up, I reluctantly agreed. I thought we'd be a family again. 3 adults under one roof, looking out for each other. Instead, I learned how easily love can be twisted into something unrecognizable. The house I'd sold to downsize, my house, gave them the down payment for their bigger place in Green Bay. I contributed almost everything I had left. I moved into the smallest bedroom. I gave up privacy, independence, even the small routines that made me feel like myself. And for what? For a son and daughter who would sit across the kitchen table, sip coffee I paid for, and tell me, without flinching, that I should be grateful they let me stay. The night it all broke was a Tuesday. Shannon had made pasta, and I offered to help with dishes. She turned to me smirking and said, "You're lucky we feed you. If it weren't for us, you'd be on the street." Daniel didn't correct her. He nodded like that was the most obvious truth in the world. I remember how my hands trembled as I set the plate in the sink. I remember thinking, this is what my life has become. A woman with no dignity, no voice, no place that's truly hers. I went to bed early that night, staring at the ceiling for hours. My heart was hammering, my mind running through every sacrifice, every bedtime story, every dollar I'd poured into them. It didn't matter. In their eyes, I was a burden. And that's when a thought settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. They are not going to decide how my story ends. I was done begging for scraps of affection, done waiting for them to see my worth. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I woke up before sunrise, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. As I lay there, listening to the sound of my own breathing, I felt something inside me click into place, like a lock finally opening. I got out of bed, careful not to wake anyone, and padded down the hallway to the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, looking around at a house I had helped pay for but would never truly belong to. It's a strange thing when your life becomes unrecognizable, even stranger when you realize you don't have to keep pretending it fits you. I took out my worn leather checkbook and ran my fingers over the cover. There, in the back pocket, was the deed to the house, my house in Madison. The one I'd signed over to Daniel and Shannon so they could build a better future. Technically, the sale had never been finalized. They'd moved in before the last payment was processed, trusting that my name on the paperwork meant I'd follow through. They were wrong. I thought about all the times I'd tried to make peace, the times I swallowed my pride, The times I let them make me feel small because I didn't want to lose whatever little connection we had left. But in that moment, sitting alone in the kitchen, I realized something that made my chest ache and my throat close. I already had lost them. I finished my coffee, washed the cup, and dried it with the dish towel, like any other morning. But this time, I was calm. I was certain. I was done. I went back to my room and quietly started packing. One suitcase, one carry-on bag, everything else I left behind. They'd made it clear that nothing I owned mattered here, so I wouldn't take much with me. By the time the sun was up, my heart felt strangely light. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering how to please anyone. I wasn't worrying about whether I was in the way. I was just free. Around 7, Shannon came into the hallway, bleary-eyed. She saw the suitcase propped by the bedroom door and blinked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What are you doing?" she asked. I zipped the last pocket and looked her square in the face. "Leaving." Her mouth fell open. "Where are you going to go?" I almost laughed, because she sounded more inconvenienced than concerned. "Somewhere I'm wanted," I said simply. Daniel emerged a minute later, scratching his jaw. His expression was sour, like he'd bitten into something rotten. "You can't just take off. That's irresponsible." I bristled at the word, irresponsible, as if I hadn't held their entire lives together for decades, as if I hadn't sacrificed every piece of myself to make sure they never went without. I picked up my bag. "I've already spoken to the realtor. The house is going back on the market." "You mean our house?" Shannon demanded, voice shrill. I met her gaze without blinking. "Number my house. You were never on the deed." Daniel's face turned red, then pale. I watched the realization dawn on him. The security blanket they'd been so sure of was gone. The entitlement they'd wrapped themselves in was unraveling. "You can't do this," he said, voice low. "Where will we go?" I shrugged. "That's not my problem anymore." I could have said more, could have listed every insult, every slight, every moment they made me feel worthless. But I didn't. I was done explaining myself. I stepped out onto the porch. The morning air smelled like freedom. I thought I'd feel guilt, regret, maybe even fear, but all I felt was relief. I climbed into the cab I'd scheduled the night before. As we pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. Some doors, once closed, are never meant to be reopened. The cab driver didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for that. I think he could tell from my face that this wasn't a simple trip. I gave him the address of a small motel on the edge of Madison, one of the last places that still felt familiar. As we drove through the early morning streets, memories flickered past the window like ghosts. The grocery store where I used to buy Daniel his favorite cereal. The library where Shannon learned to read. The little diner Bill and I went to every Sunday. I wondered how a life could hold so much love and still end up here, me with a suitcase in my lap, feeling like I was escaping from a prison I'd built myself. When we reached the motel, I paid the driver and thanked him. He helped me with my bags, giving me a kind smile that felt more genuine than anything I'd seen in my children's faces in years. Once I was alone in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle around me. It was a small space. Plain walls, thin carpet, the faint smell of lemon disinfectant, but it was mine. No one could barge in and tell me I was a burden here. No one could measure my worth by how many meals I cooked or how much I contributed. I exhaled, feeling like I'd been holding my breath for decades. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. The realtor confirmed she could relist the house in Green Bay immediately. She sounded surprised when I told her the situation, but she didn't pry. She just promised she'd move quickly. I also called my old friend, Carla, who still lived in Madison. We hadn't spoken much since Bill died. I'd been too busy taking care of everyone else to nurture my own friendships. But when she answered, her voice warm and familiar, I felt something inside me crack open. "Margaret?" she said, incredulous. "Honey, are you all right?" I almost lied, almost said I was fine, but I was too tired to pretend anymore. "No," I whispered. "I'm not." "Where are you? I'm coming to get you." Within an hour, she was there, still in her bathrobe, hair unbrushed, eyes worried. She hugged me so tight I could hardly breathe, and for the first time in so long, I let myself cry. When we finally sat down, I told her everything. The insults, the manipulation. The moment I realized I couldn't stay one more day without losing myself completely. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting over mine. When I finished, she said something I'll never forget. You did the bravest thing a mother can do. You chose yourself. That night, I stayed at Carla's house. She made us grilled cheese sandwiches and poured 2 glasses of cheap red wine, and for a moment, I felt like a person again, not just someone's aging mother to be tolerated. The next morning, I woke to the sound of her humming in the kitchen. I thought of Daniel and Shannon, probably pacing their living room in a panic, realizing that the house wasn't theirs after all. A part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that all the love I'd poured into them hadn't been enough to teach them compassion. But as I sat at Carla's table, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, I also felt something else. Hope. Because maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a life that belonged only to me. The days that followed were a strange mix of sorrow and quiet liberation. Carla insisted I stay with her as long as I needed, and though I felt guilty imposing, she wouldn't hear of it. She had a spare bedroom and a softness I didn't realize how badly I needed. Every morning, she'd knock on my door and ask if I felt up to breakfast. Some mornings, I joined her. Other times, I just sat by the window, staring out at the street I'd walked 1,000 times when Bill was alive. I started to think about how much I'd lost by always putting my children first. I'd let friendships fade, let hobbies disappear, let my own voice go silent because I was so determined to keep the peace. And now, after all that sacrifice, my children saw me as nothing but a liability. It was a brutal truth to face. On the third day, my phone started ringing. Daniel, then Shannon, then Daniel again. I watched the calls come in, my heart thumping like I'd done something criminal. I knew what they wanted, to scream at me for daring to take back what was mine. I didn't answer. Instead, I called the realtor to confirm the house was officially listed. She said there had already been interest, and she'd scheduled a showing that afternoon. When I hung up, my hands were steady. I didn't owe them an explanation. That afternoon, Carla suggested we go out for a walk. I hesitated. Part of me was afraid they'd show up, find me on the sidewalk, and cause a scene. But she looked me straight in the eye and said, "You are allowed to exist in the world without apologizing for it." So we walked. We strolled past the old park where I used to take Daniel and Shannon to play. Past the bookstore I hadn't visited in years, past a little cafe with bright yellow chairs on the patio. On a whim, we went inside. The barista greeted us with a smile and recommended their lemon scones. We sat by the window, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt normal, not invisible, not a burden, just a woman having coffee with a friend. While Carla stepped away to take a call, I pulled out my phone. There were 15 missed calls and a string of messages from Daniel. "Mom, call me back. What are you doing? You're ruining everything. We took care of you. This is how you repay us?" I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the old reflex to explain myself, to smooth it over, to apologize. God, it was strong. But I forced myself to read each word and really see it for what it was. Control. They didn't care how I felt. They only cared that they were losing the comfort they'd come to expect. And suddenly, I felt lighter. Because I finally understood. I hadn't failed them. They had failed me. I slipped my phone back into my purse and looked out the window at the people passing by. Couples holding hands, teenagers laughing, a woman walking her dog. All these tiny, ordinary moments of freedom. I wanted that. I wanted a life that didn't revolve around tiptoeing around other people's moods. A life that belonged to me, even if it was small and quiet. When Carla returned, she studied my face. "You okay?" I smiled. A real smile this time. "I think I'm going to be." We walked home slowly, the late afternoon sun warm on my shoulders. And when I went to bed that night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for whatever insult tomorrow would bring. I was finally out of their house, and I was never going back. The house sold faster than I expected. Within 10 days, I had an offer well above what Daniel and Shannon knew it was worth. My realtor was delighted. I was relieved. But the morning she called to confirm the sale was final, my phone lit up again, Daniel's name in big letters across the screen. My stomach clenched. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. So I took a deep breath and answered. For a moment, he said nothing. Just breathing, fast and ragged. Then, his voice, low and edged with fury. You really sold it. I closed my eyes. Yes, I did. That was our home. No, I said gently. It never was. The silence that followed was a cold, empty space. I thought maybe he'd hang up. Part of me hoped he would, but he didn't. You are unbelievable, he spat. After everything we did for you. I didn't let him finish. After everything you did to me, I corrected. My voice didn't shake. I'm done pretending. He launched into a tirade, how I was selfish, how Shannon was in tears, how I'd ruined their lives. I listened, letting the words wash over me. They sounded small, petty, like a child's tantrum when someone finally tells them no. When he ran out of breath, I spoke as calmly as I could. I spent my whole life giving, and when I needed kindness, you gave me contempt. I won't spend what years I have left begging you to love me. You're going to regret this, he warned. I thought about that as I hung up. Maybe I would. Maybe there would be nights when the loneliness would sneak up on me, when I'd ache for the idea of a family that never really existed. But I also knew this. Regret is lighter than resentment. And I was done carrying resentment. Carla walked in a few minutes later, a fresh pot of coffee in her hands. She didn't ask what happened. She just poured me a cup and squeezed my shoulder. That afternoon, I went to the bank to deposit the check from the sale. As I slid the envelope across the counter, the teller glanced at me with curiosity. Selling a house? She asked politely. I nodded. Just closing a chapter. I almost expected to feel sad, but instead I felt clean, like I'd finally scrubbed off years of grime I didn't even know I was wearing. Outside the bank, I stood on the sidewalk, my purse heavy with the first real freedom I'd had in decades. And I knew it was time to decide what came next. Carla offered to let me stay with her as long as I wanted, and I loved her for it. But I also knew I needed something that was truly mine, not borrowed, not temporary. That night, I sat at her kitchen table with a spiral notebook and a pen. I made a list. Find an apartment near the lake, start volunteering again. Visit the senior center and see about classes. Reconnect with the book club I'd left when Bill died. The list was simple, but it felt like a map back to myself. Later, as I folded the paper and tucked it into my purse, Carla looked at me with tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. For the first time, I believed it. I was no longer the woman who lived in other people's houses, tiptoeing around their tempers. I was Margaret Holt, and I was finally free. I found a small apartment overlooking Lake Monona, just a 15-minute walk from the farmer's market I used to love. It wasn't fancy. 2 rooms, old carpet, a balcony just big enough for a chair and a few potted plants. But the first time I stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The landlord, a soft-spoken woman named Linda, handed me the keys with a smile. Fresh start? She asked. I nodded, blinking back tears. Something like that. Carla helped me move in. We didn't have much to carry, just my suitcase, a few boxes of clothes and books, and the old photo albums I refused to leave behind. As we unpacked, she kept shooting me little looks, like she was trying to memorize my face in this moment. You're really doing it, she said, taping up the empty boxes. Doing what? Choosing yourself. I didn't know how to answer. The truth was, even in that tiny apartment with my name on the lease and no one to answer to, part of me was terrified. I'd spent so long belonging to other people that I wasn't sure how to belong to myself. But that night, after Carla left, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the breeze smelled like fresh water and summer grass. And I thought, maybe this is how it starts. The next morning, I woke early, just as the sun was coming up. I pulled on a cardigan and walked down to the shoreline. My joints ached, but I didn't care. I found a bench and sat there for hours, watching the light spill across the water. No one interrupted me. No one demanded anything. I didn't have to explain where I was going or why. It was such a small freedom, but it felt enormous. Later that week, I signed up to volunteer at the library, the same one I'd taken Daniel and Shannon to when they were little. The woman at the front desk looked delighted to have extra hands. She gave me a stack of forms and a schedule and welcomed me like I was someone valuable. When I got home, there was a letter in my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Daniel's. I stood in my narrow hallway, heart thumping, debating whether to open it. A part of me was afraid. Afraid that his words could still reach me, still undo everything I was building. But I tore it open anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper. We don't understand why you're doing this, but if you ever want to come back, you can. No apology. No acknowledgement of what they'd said. Just the assumption that I'd come crawling back eventually. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the drawer by the door. And I knew, with a clarity that felt like breathing clean air, I would never go back. That evening, Carla came by with takeout. We ate on the floor because I didn't have a dining table yet. She raised her glass of iced tea. "To freedom," she said. I clinked my glass against hers. To freedom. When she left, I sat alone in the quiet. I thought about all the ways my life had been reduced, first by grief, then by the people I loved most. And then I thought about the ways I was rebuilding it, brick by brick, with no one's permission but my own. Outside, the lake was turning gold in the sunset. I stood there, feeling something settle in my bones, a certainty that no matter what came next, I'd already done the hardest thing. I had chosen myself, and I wasn't sorry. A month later, I sat at my little kitchen table, the late afternoon light spilling across my notebook. I was making a new list, things I wanted to do before the year ended. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would impress anyone else. Just simple, quiet ambitions. Join the community garden, take a watercolor class, learn how to make bread from scratch, visit the lighthouse in Door County. I was halfway through writing when my phone buzzed with another text from Shannon. "Mom, we're worried about you. Please answer." I read it twice, waiting for the familiar ache to tighten in my chest. But it didn't. Because I finally understood the difference between guilt and responsibility. I would always love my children. That love was the first and last truth of my life. But loving them didn't mean letting them treat me like I didn't matter. It didn't mean living under the weight of their entitlement. I set the phone aside and returned to my list. An hour later, I slipped on my shoes and walked down to the lake. It had become my ritual. Sunset on the shore, the air cooling on my skin, the quiet hush of the water against the rocks. As I stood there, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Contentment. Not the desperate hope that someone would finally see me. Not the hollow satisfaction of pleasing everyone but myself. Just the simple, steady knowledge that I was enough. A breeze rustled through the trees behind me, carrying the smell of grass and lake water. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. Somewhere, Daniel and Shannon were probably still trying to make sense of what I'd done. Maybe they always would. Maybe someday they'd understand that I hadn't left to punish them. I'd left because I couldn't keep punishing myself, and maybe they wouldn't understand at all. Either way, it wasn't my burden anymore. The sun slipped lower, turning the water a deep, burnished gold. I thought of Bill and all the dreams we'd had for this season of our lives, travel, quiet evenings, grandchildren who might love us the way we loved them. I let myself mourn it for a moment, and then I let it go. I turned back toward my apartment, my steps slow but sure. I didn't know exactly what the future held, But for the first time, it felt like it was truly mine. And whatever came next, I would meet it as Margaret Holt, whole, unashamed, and finally free. As I reached my door, I looked back once more at the lake. "Thank you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was thanking. Maybe the woman I'd once been. Maybe the woman I was still becoming. Inside, my phone was blinking with a new message. I let it blink. Because tonight I had no one to answer to but myself, and that was exactly how I wanted it.